Hi, welcome to Tuesdays with Terra. I'm Terra Bundance, and today I'm going to talk about certain traits that may support us or hinder us in relationships. So, I like to talk about certain aspects of personalities and types, but that doesn't necessarily include Myers-Briggs or love language or some of the numerology things, because all of those are really awesome and fascinating and helpful and supportive, but we kind of know how to get information about those things. What I'm going to talk about are more like personality traits that show up within us that we may or may not even notice about ourselves, but it's what either causes us to connect with other people or clash with other people. And until we have sort of an understanding of ourselves and then also possibly other people, it's sort of a struggle to make that connection. But once we do have more awareness about these certain traits, it's easier to work through problems or issues because it's easier to recognize that this isn't necessarily about me or the other person, but maybe it's just that we don't connect somewhere in the middle. Okay, the first personality trait that I'm going to talk about is introvert extrovert. So we all generally tend to know if we're an introvert or an extrovert, but some people don't really know that for sure. And what it means is, where do you get the most energy? Do you get the most energy being by yourself, away from other people, kind of alone, able to process the information that you've just experienced or that you are experiencing in the moment, that fills you up with energy? Or do you tend to feel energized by groups, being involved in more, having more people around you and surrounding yourself with more people? So if you're an introvert, you tend to want to be on your own, doing your own thing most of the time. Doesn't mean that you don't like or aren't good with groups. It just means that you tend to be more energized by being alone. And then if you're an extrovert, that means that you tend to be more energized by being around other people. So when you're by yourself, you're kind of seeking out other ways to connect with people. The next personality trait that I like to talk about is internal processor and external processor. So the introvert extrovert doesn't necessarily line up with internal processor, external processor, because I've met many different people from both who blend differently than you would expect. So generally, an external processor is someone who tends to need to talk through things to be able to process through it. And an internal processor, like the word says, is someone who generally processes very well on the inside. They're able to think through things internally and not have to talk about it. So the clashes happen when you have an internal processor and an external processor, and they are looking for the other one to process the same way that they are. So an external processor wants to talk about things, and an internal processor has to process internally and doesn't want to talk about it, and even can't take in all the information that the external processor is kind of putting out at them. And the internal processor tends to shut down and blank out. And the external processor thinks, why is this person not communicating with me? But then an internal processor, when it comes to communication, is going to process all they need. And then anytime they're ready to talk to someone else about it, they just let them know what they've processed. Simple as that. There's no talking about it. There's no conversation about it. This is what I figured out. And the external processor is like, tell me more. And the internal processor is like, there's nothing more to tell you. I've already done all the work. I've already done all the processing. And the external processor goes crazy and feels mad and angry and tends to, possibly lash out. So when you look at these two types, and then you try to blend them with introvert extrovert, you're going to get all combinations. So I'm an extrovert external processor. I'm somebody who tends to be really great around crowds, and I'm also somebody who tends to process out loud. My family members are different, various ones. And where we clash is when we don't feel like we're being heard, or feeling like we're connected, or that we're able to process the way that we need to. And what that means is, let's say I have one family member who is an introvert internal processor. Okay. Pretty typical. Extrovert external processor, introvert internal processor. You kind of assume or expect that on some level. But then what if you've got a family member, which I do, who's an introvert but an external processor. Confusing, right? Because that person wants to talk, but they only want to talk to the people they're close to. They need to process out loud, but they don't know how to put themselves in situations where they're comfortable with a bunch of people. Then I have another family member who is an extrovert internal processor. So he seems like someone who, because he's an extrovert, easy around crowds, feels filled up by crowds, but doesn't really talk a lot and doesn't really, have conversations unless they're very deep conversations. And so I might be waiting for that person to process with me. And because he can't, because he processes internally, there's some disconnect and discomfort. So once we figured all of that out, it's become very easy, much easier for us in all those relationships for us to be able to process what we need to, how we need to. And when an internal processor is filled up and they can say, overwhelmed, can't take in any more information. And the external processor can go, okay, cool. I'll go talk to one of my other friends who can process this out loud with me. And then if an introvert is processing, and the extrovert's like, what's going on? Why aren't you talking to me? And the introvert's like, I'm just working through something. Talk to me about it. I don't really want to. It doesn't help me to do that. So the extrovert can take the time to allow and support that person to process how they need to. And then the internal processor can then ask the external processor, are you willing to just listen and hold space with me and decide how that feels? So just having this understanding and this awareness helps us strengthen and build more connection in relationships. When we don't have that understanding or that awareness, it creates disconnect and it creates turmoil and it creates tension. And sometimes it just doesn't work out very well in the long run. Now, it absolutely can. So we're going to add another one. The next thing I'm going to talk about is someone who is a slow processor and someone who is a fast processor. So what I've noticed over time is that often an internal processor is also someone who's quick to process things, whereas an external processor may take a lot more time to process things. Not always that way. An internal processor could easily also be a slow processor, and an external processor may be a very quick processor. So what I mean by that is when you receive information from external places, how quickly do you feel like you can move through an understanding of what that thing means? For me, if something new is coming, because I am a slow processor, even though I'm an extrovert, external processor, I'm very much of a slow processor, which means that I need to take information in numerous times or over a long period of time. As I hear the information, it sinks in. I'm able to process out loud with someone else or write it down or talk about it. And then over time, it clicks. And usually, because I take my time getting there, it's locked in forever. So what I've noticed also is that fast processors tend to be able to quickly move through something, figure it out, get the information, done. But often, because they've gone through it very quickly, out of sight, out of mind. So a lot of times a fast processor may not remember something that you told them or something that you talked about a few weeks later because they've already dealt with it, and then it's gone because now they're on to the next thing. So we've got to not take these things personally. I can't take it personally when a fast processor, internal processor, introvert person who's very different from me does their thing differently. What I can do is recognize, like, oh, this person processes differently than I do. And what that means for me is I can slow down, or I can take some deep breaths, or I can decide, this is not a comfortable moment for me to talk about this thing with that person. And then I can set it up for them. I can say, hey, I really want to talk about this thing. So can you please let me know, or can we work out a time that's going to work for both of us that we can talk about this thing, or that we can process through this thing, or that we can help each other understand or figure out a certain thing. This is very, very helpful in partnerships, especially whether it's love relationships or a business relationship. Whenever you've got somebody that you're with a lot and you're really trying to work through things together, if you have different ways of figuring things out and processing information, then having that knowledge, having that understanding and awareness is going to support you both in being able to get things done. Okay. And that means in love relationships and partnerships that you spend every day together and you're always trying to work through things, especially if you have kids or property or bills or pets. You've got to be able to have conversations that support the greater good, the greater whole. And because you're living together on a daily basis, this is something that once you work it out, life becomes easier. And I've learned that the hard way in numerous relationships. And now, because I have this basic understanding of the different types of people, life has become much easier for me. So I wanted to share those things because more than anything, it gives just a little key, a little information for you to take in and receive and allow yourself to figure out, like, what am I possibly? What are my partners? What are my friends? What are my business partnerships? What are my kids? What are my parents? And once we figure all of that stuff out, life is so much easier. We stop taking things so personally. It's all about understanding relationship with self first so that we can build and grow and evolve in our relationships with our family and friends and business relationships. So when we look at relationships with friends, family members, business partners, acquaintances, anyone, it's really important for us to recognize kind of our traits of how we process information, if we're extrovert or introvert, how we process information, whether it's slowly or quickly. Are we internal processors or external processors? This makes relationships much more palatable, much more easy to handle and live with. And it really is about taking care of yourself. So, my family and friends, blessings and love to each and every one of you. Be you out loud. Have a blessed and beautiful day.